Nobody warns you that the moment your life splits in two will happen while a string quartet plays Pachelbel and you're holding a glass of warm champagne you never asked for. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there. The way Marvella kept glancing at our father during the ceremony, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth when he adjusted his cufflinks, the way our cousin Obafemi avoided my eyes during cocktail hour. But I was busy watching my sister float through the room in $50,000 worth of organza, her new husband, Stellan, trailing behind her like a golden retriever who had just been awarded a trophy, and I let myself believe, for a few dangerous hours, that maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. The band had just switched from soft background music to something with a proper beat, the kind of song that makes aunts abandon their heels near the centerpieces, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Firm. The grip of a man who has practiced that exact gesture in front of a mirror, who has decided in advance exactly how authoritative it needs to feel. I turned around. My father, Cornelius Vaudreuil, was standing there in his charcoal suit, the one that cost more than my first car, looking at me the way a surgeon looks at a patient before delivering news he has already rehearsed. In his left hand, he held an envelope, cream-colored, thick. The kind of envelope that means someone paid a lawyer by the hour. "Read this," he said, not quietly, not in a whisper meant to preserve my dignity. He said it at a volume calibrated for an audience, the way men like Cornelius say everything, not to communicate, but to perform. I felt the room shift. Not physically, but in the way a room does when 20 people simultaneously decide to pretend they're not watching something. The champagne glasses stopped moving. Conversations tapered mid-sentence. Marvella's mother-in-law, a narrow woman named Priscilla, who collected grievances the way other people collect art, turned a full 45 degrees in her chair. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Cornelius. And here is the thing nobody tells you about moments like that. Your body knows before your mind does. Before I consciously understood what was happening, something deep in my chest had already made its decision. A kind of stillness descended on me, not the stillness of shock, but of recognition. The kind you feel when something you have been quietly dreading for years finally arrives at the door. I took the envelope. I did not open it, not right away. I tucked it under my arm the way you'd tuck away a magazine you intend to read on the train, glanced once at the letter as if it were a minor administrative inconvenience, and then I looked at Cornelius and smiled. Not a wounded smile, not a defiant smile, just a smile, the kind that contains nothing he could use, and I turned back toward the dance floor. I need to tell you something about my family before I tell you what was in that letter, because without that context, the story doesn't make sense, or rather, it makes exactly the wrong kind of sense, the kind that makes you sympathize with the wrong people. The Vaudreuil family has money the way some houses have mold. You don't always see it, but it shapes everything. It determines what rooms feel habitable, what walls are structurally sound, what you're allowed to touch. Cornelius's grandfather built a regional logistics company in the 1940s out of something between vision and ruthlessness, and every generation since has been measured against that founding myth. My sister Marvella was always the heir. Not officially. Officially, the family business was supposed to pass to whoever was most capable, most prepared, most committed to the legacy. But capability in this family was always measured on a scale that tilted toward Marvella, and we all knew it, and for most of my childhood, I simply accepted it as the natural order of things, the way you accept that gravity pulls downward and not to the left. I had tried, for years, to earn my place in that order. I worked for the company through my 20s. I sat through dinners where Cornelius talked about succession as if I weren't in the room. I attended board meetings where my input was treated like weather, acknowledged, then immediately forgotten. I watched Marvella be given opportunities that were never offered to me, and I told myself that if I simply outperformed everyone, the math would eventually be undeniable. But the Vaudreuil family does not run on math. It runs on loyalty of a very specific type, the kind that requires you to have no interior life that hasn't been pre-approved. the kind that requires you to be grateful for your exclusion and call it mentorship. 2 years before Marvella's wedding, I had a conversation with Cornelius that ended with him telling me that I was too independent to be trusted. I had proposed a partnership with a smaller competitor that would have opened us into 3 new markets. He turned it down without explanation, and then, 6 months later, did an inferior version of the same deal with a man he'd known since prep school. When I pointed this out, quietly, in his office, he told me the conversation was over. It was, in a way, he didn't intend. I spent the following week thinking about something I had been circling for a long time. And then I stopped circling and started moving. The envelope contained exactly what I expected it to contain. I read it in the bathroom, not because I was hiding, but because I needed 30 seconds without an audience. The paper was heavy, the language formal. It cited a clause in my grandfather's original will that allowed the family trust to be restructured with unanimous consent of the board. It informed me that said restructuring had taken place 6 weeks prior. It outlined, in 3 precise paragraphs, that I was being removed from the trust, from the board, and from any formal stake in the Vaudreuil family holdings, effective immediately. At the bottom, in her own handwriting, Marvella had added a single line. "You always wanted to do things your own way. Now you can." I read it twice. Then I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. What I felt was not what they expected me to feel. What I felt was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a storm that has finally broken after weeks of humidity. The terrible waiting was over. The shape of the thing was clear now, no longer lurking in peripheral vision, but standing fully in the light, and it was smaller than the shadow it had cast. I went back to the reception. I found my table. I ate the entree, which was an overwrought beef tenderloin with a reduction that tasted mostly of ambition. I spoke to my cousins. I danced with my Aunt Yolanda, who was 81 and had no idea any of this was happening, and who danced with the focused joy of someone who has survived enough to know that the floor is the only honest place in any room. Marvella watched me from across the room all night. She was waiting for something. I could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she kept returning her attention to me between conversations with her new husband's relatives. She was waiting for me to crack, for the tears, for the confrontation, for the scene that would make her the reasonable one and me the unstable one, the proof of why the decision had been correct, the final act of a play she had written without telling me I was in it. I didn't give it to her, not because I was performing calm, but because I genuinely was calm, because I knew something she didn't know. 8 months before that wedding, on a Tuesday in November, I had signed a document of my own. It wasn't dramatic. It happened in a conference room in the financial district, in the presence of 2 lawyers and a notary who smelled faintly of cedar. I signed my name to papers establishing a holding company, a new one, mine alone, structured around assets I had been quietly assembling for 3 years. It had started with a conversation I'd had with a man named Equency Thorvald at an industry conference. Equency ran a mid-sized logistics operation that served markets Cornelius had always dismissed as too small, too fragmented, too much work for too little return. Cornelius was wrong. He was wrong in the specific way that men who inherited money are often wrong, which is to say, confidently, and about things that don't affect them personally. The markets Equency served were underserved, not unviable. They were full of businesses that were growing precisely because they had been ignored by the large players. Equency and I had coffee, then dinner, then a series of phone calls that gradually became a plan. I brought in 2 other partners, a woman named Solange Detmer, who had spent 15 years in supply chain and had been systematically overlooked at every company she worked for because she was the kind of person who was too good at her job to be promoted away from it, and a man named Crispin Halloway, who had built and sold 2 smaller companies and had the specific calm of someone who has already proved something and no longer needs to. We structured the whole thing carefully. I drew no salary from the Vaudreuil company during the build-up period. I didn't need to, because I had been saving aggressively for years, partly out of instinct and partly out of a quiet suspicion that I was always going to need an exit. I kept my participation in the new venture completely private. Not deceptively, I had no legal obligation to disclose it, but deliberately, because I understood that if Cornelius knew what I was building, he would find a way to interfere. Not dramatically, that wasn't his style. Quietly, administratively. A word to the right contact, a suggestion at the right lunch. I had watched him do it to others. I was not going to give him the opportunity to do it to me. So I kept 2 separate calendars. I conducted the new business from a phone that wasn't connected to any family accounts. When Quincy and I met in person, which we did about once every 3 weeks, we met in neighborhoods Cornelius would never visit. A diner near the freight terminal, a coffee shop above a printing warehouse, once, memorably, in a parking garage that smelled of oil and February cold. None of it felt conspiratorial. It felt like freedom. The specific freedom of doing something for its own sake, with no audience, for no inheritance, to prove nothing to anyone who could take it away. By the time I sat in that wedding reception and read the letter in the bathroom, our company had been operational for 6 months. We had signed contracts with 4 anchor clients. We had a 5th in advanced negotiation. Quincy and Solange were already managing a team of 11 people. Crispin had brought in a seed investment that gave us 18 months of runway, even in a conservative scenario. The document I had signed was not just a holding company agreement. It was the first of several. Before the wedding, I had also signed a term sheet with the 5th client, a regional manufacturer that would, if the relationship matured the way the projections suggested, eventually represent more annual revenue than 3 of the Vaujoy company's current accounts combined. So when Marvella's handwriting told me I could now do things my own way, she was 8 months too late. I already was. The rest of the reception passed the way the aftermath of something always passes, in a kind of heightened slow motion, where ordinary things acquire strange weight. I noticed the way the candles guttered when the servers moved through the room too quickly. I noticed the topography of the floral arrangements, how the white peonies had been placed at intervals designed to prevent the eye from resting anywhere too long. I noticed that Stellan, Marvella's new husband, spent most of the evening at the bar with a glass of something amber, talking to a man I didn't recognize, and that he never once looked over at my sister with the specific expression of a man who is watching the person he loves in her natural habitat. I stored all of it away. Not for any particular reason, just because that's what the mind does when the rest of the body has decided to be very, very still. My Aunt Yolanda asked me, when we finished dancing, if I was all right. She was the only person in that room who asked with genuine curiosity rather than appetite. The difference, when you've spent enough time around both, is unmistakable. I'm fine, I told her, and meant it in the complicated way that fine can mean when it's true but also contains entire floors of a building you're not ready to show anyone. She held my face in both hands for a moment, studying me the way only very old people who have buried enough of their contemporaries can study a younger face, looking not at the surface but at the structure underneath, checking for cracks. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she said finally. She never let them see her either. I didn't ask what she meant. I think we both understood. Here is what I learned in the years that followed about the architecture of that night. Marvella and Cornelius had planned it together. The timing, the reception, the public nature of the delivery, the audience of family and Stellan's relatives was not incidental. It was the point. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the story to spread through cousins and aunts and industry contacts that I had been formally and publicly cut off, that I had stood there and received the news and could do nothing about it because I had nothing to fall back on. They believed this because they had watched me for years and concluded that everything I had was tied to them, that I had no independent standing, no independent relationships, no independent anything, that I was, in the end, a dependent in a suit. This was an understandable conclusion. It was also completely wrong. The phone call I got from Cornelius, about 4 months after the wedding, was one of the more satisfying conversations I have had in my adult life. Not because I gloated, which I did not, but because of the specific quality of the silence on his end when I explained, calmly, what I had built and what it was currently worth. That silence lasted about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I could feel him recalculating, running the numbers, adjusting the story he had been telling himself about me, and arriving somewhere he hadn't expected to be. He offered to talk about reconciliation. I told him I was open to a conversation. What I did not tell him was that by the time he called, we had already received and were evaluating a preliminary acquisition offer from a larger logistics group that would have valued our company at a multiple that made the Vaudreuil Trust, with its aging assets and Cornelius's conservative management, look like a footnote. I didn't tell him because it wasn't his business anymore. Marvella and I don't speak. I don't know if we ever will. I've thought about what reconciliation would require, and I've decided that I'm not interested in performing forgiveness for an audience, which is the only kind she has ever understood. But here's the thing I want you to understand about that night, the thing that actually matters. I smiled at my father, not because I was pretending to be okay. I smiled because I genuinely was okay, better than okay, in ways he couldn't see and didn't have the framework to imagine. The cruelty of what he did was real. The loneliness of that moment was real. The grief of finally knowing with complete certainty that the family I had spent my whole life trying to earn was never going to let me in. That was real too. But it was also freedom. The letter he handed me cut me out of a structure that had been limiting me for my entire adult life. The terms he thought were a punishment were, functionally, a release. And I had already, quietly, on a Tuesday in November, in a conference room that smelled of cedar, signed the papers that made it one. The string quartet was playing again by the time I got back to the dance floor. My Aunt Yolanda found me near the edge of the parquet and grabbed my hand with both of hers and pulled me in, her 81 years of movement completely unconcerned with the performance happening in the periphery of the room, focused entirely on the simple fact of the music and the floor and the moment. I danced, not to prove a point, not to show anyone anything, but because Yolanda was right. The floor is the only honest place in any room, and I had nothing left to pretend. People ask me, sometimes, what the lesson is. They expect something clean, a maxim, a principle, a 5-step framework for quietly outmaneuvering people who underestimate you. I don't have one of those. What I have is this. The families that wound us most are often the ones that accidentally clarify us. Cornelius handed me that envelope thinking he was ending something. He was, but not what he thought. He was ending the version of me that still needed his approval to feel legitimate. The version that had been operating at half capacity for years, because some part of me was always negotiating for a seat at a table that was never actually available. The document I signed in November was not an act of revenge. I wasn't thinking about revenge when I was building the company. I was thinking about markets and operations and the particular satisfaction of working with people like Aquency and Solange and Crispin, who were excellent at what they did and had no patience for politics. The revenge, if that's what you want to call it, was incidental, a consequence. What I was actually doing was simply living forward, living outward, building something that was mine in a way that the Vaudreuil legacy never could have been. The letter is still in my desk, in the original cream-colored envelope. I keep it not as a wound or a trophy, but as a reference point, a marker for the last moment before the shape of my life became clear to me. I don't need to open it anymore. I remember every word. But I remember better the feeling of folding it and tucking it away and turning back toward the music. Some doors close from the outside, and you can't do anything about it. But that's okay, because you can build your own. And if you liked what I just told you, hit that button below and subscribe. There's more where this came from, and the next story is even harder to believe.